The document was 14 pages long, and Verathsas had read it 3 times before he noticed the discrepancy. He sat in the operations center of Tehran Station's third-tier intelligence annex, a room that smelled of recycled coolant and something faintly organic he had never been able to identify, surrounded by the low hum of data processors and the soft blue light of a dozen holographic displays. His secondary appendages were folded against his thorax in a posture his analysts read as concentration. It was, in fact, something closer to confusion, which for a Solvati senior field analyst of 17 standard cycles was almost worse than fear. The document was a captured enemy operational brief, a Keth-Al courier packet intercepted 9 days ago in the debris field near Relay Point Sigma, decoded over 4 days by his best cryptography team, and delivered to his desk this morning with the kind of quiet reverence analysts reserve for material they know will matter. The Keth-Al were not subtle planners. Their operational briefings were dense, thorough, and admirably honest about their intentions. What they intended here, according to pages 1 through 11, was the systematic dismantling of the Joint Galactic Council Expeditionary Force currently holding the Halveth Corridor, beginning with the destruction of Terran Station's communications relay and ending with the ground-level elimination of what they called the primary command architecture of the human contingent. Pages 12 through 14 were the threat assessment. Verath had read those 3 times. The problem was simple, which was what made it complicated. The Keth-Al had attached a priority target list, 6 names. The first 5 were exactly who he expected. Colonel Dravasi, the human contingent's commanding officer. Commander Okafor, logistics and supply. Lieutenant Commander Vance, communications. Chief Warrant Hollenbeck, technical systems. And Dr. Amos Patel, medical command. Standard decapitation targeting. Every one of them held a flag rank or specialist designation that would cause genuine operational disruption if removed. The 6th name was Corporal Maya Reyes. Support designation, secondary personnel, assigned to Forward Observation Team 7. According to the human contingent's own organizational manifest, which Verath had pulled up on his secondary display for comparison, she held no command authority, no specialized technical designation, no rank above the 3rd tier of the human enlisted structure. She was listed as support. The Keth-Al had given her the highest individual threat rating on the list. Not Colonel Dravasi, whose signature on 24 operational orders had shaped the entire corridor campaign. Not Commander Okafor, without whom supply routing across 4 contested systems would collapse inside a week. Not even Hollenbeck, whose technical expertise had rendered 3 Keth-Al disruption attempts completely inert. The Keth-Al, whose intelligence apparatus was among the most respected in the sector and whose analysts did not make clerical errors, had assigned their highest priority elimination rating to a corporal. Verath set down the document. He picked it up again. He set it down. He sent a request to the Human Contingent's liaison office before the 2nd hour of his shift had completed. The reply came back in 40 minutes. Corporal Reyes was available. She was, in fact, already on station, having returned from a 12-day forward observation rotation 18 hours ago. She would report to the intelligence annex at the 3rd hour. She arrived 4 minutes early, which Verath had not expected, and she sat down in the chair across his desk without being invited to, which he also had not expected. She was smaller than the data file had led him to believe, lean in a way that read less like physical training and more like someone who had not eaten regularly for an extended period, with dark hair pulled back from a face that was, by the physiognomic standards Verath had learned to apply to humans, young. She could not have been more than 26 standard years. Her eyes were the color of the coolant panels on a Caldrathi interceptor, a gray-green that caught the blue display light and held it. She set her hands flat on the table, said nothing, and waited. He appreciated that. He had interviewed 41 humans in the course of this assignment, and the majority of them opened with some form of introductory social language that his translator implant rendered accurately, but that he had never learned to parse for meaning. This one simply waited. "Corporal Reyes," he said, "I appreciate your time." "Of course," she said. Her voice was even, not flat, exactly, the way the translator sometimes flattened tonal language, but controlled in a way that Verath associated with medical personnel describing difficult outcomes. Precise, measured, carrying no invitation to escalate. He slid the document across the desk. The relevant page was already displayed, the 6th entry highlighted in the amber that his software defaulted to when flagging inconsistencies. She looked at it for a moment. Her expression did not change in any direction Verath could confidently categorize. "I was wondering if you could help me understand this," he said. She looked up from the document. "What specifically?" "The Keith Al intelligence apparatus has rated you as the highest individual threat among the 6 named targets in this brief. You hold no command rank. You hold no specialized technical designation. You are listed by your own contingent's manifest as support personnel on a forward observation team." She nodded once. "I am trying to reconcile those two facts," he said. She pulled the document closer and looked at it for another moment, the way someone looks at a map to confirm what they already know is there. "How long have you been tracking Kethal operational patterns?" she asked. 11 standard cycles, Verath said. "Then, you know, they don't inflate threat ratings. They underinflate them. They would rather deploy excess resources against a low-rated target than flag uncertainty in their own assessment process." He had known that, actually. He had just not expected her to know it. "That is accurate," he said. "So you're not here because you think they made a mistake," she said. "You're here because you want to understand why they didn't." He held very still for a moment in the way Solvati do when they are revising an assumption mid-conversation, all 4 eyes adjusting their focal depth in a small, involuntary cascade. He had told himself, walking into this interview, that he was conducting a simple assessment. He had told himself the anomaly was likely a data classification error on the Keth Al side, a misattributed action record, some battlefield bookkeeping mistake that would resolve cleanly. He had not quite believed that when he told himself, and she had located the pretense in approximately 30 seconds. "Yes," he said. "That is why I'm here." She leaned back in the chair. It was a posture that should have read as casual, and on a different human, in a different context it might have. On her, it read as something Verath did not have a clean translation for, a kind of settled readiness that reminded him more of kinetic systems in a standby state than of any social register he recognized. "Forward observation," she said. "You know what that actually means on the Halveth corridor." "I have read the operational reports," he said. "The operational reports describe it as reconnaissance and information gathering in advance of main contingent movement." She paused. "That's accurate as far as it goes." There was something in that pause. Something deliberate. The way a sentence with a missing clause is deliberate. Verath pulled up the mission logs for Forward Observation Team 7 on his secondary display. 12 deployments in 14 standard months. Average duration, 9 days. Average distance from the nearest friendly position, 68 kilometers. He looked at the casualty column. Team 7 had lost 3 members across those 12 deployments, which was, he now realized, a substantially lower attrition rate than any comparable team in the corridor. He had not noticed that before because he had not been looking at it before. The Kethal, he said carefully, appear to have detailed knowledge of at least 11 of your team's 12 deployments. 12, she said. 12. They've had good coverage since the relay point engagement 8 months ago. She said it without any particular tone, the way someone notes the weather. They started dedicating surveillance assets to our team specifically about 4 months in. He felt the very specific discomfort of discovering that a piece of information he considered significant had been known by someone else for considerably longer. That is not in any report I have reviewed. No, she agreed. It wouldn't be. He waited. She appeared to consider something in the way humans appear to consider things, a brief internal consultation visible only as a slight movement around the eyes. Then, she continued, when the Kethal start dedicating surveillance assets to a specific small unit, she said, there are 2 possible reasons. The first is that the unit is located in a strategically significant area, and they want to understand its movement patterns. The second is that the unit has done something that made them specifically curious. She looked at him steadily. We are not in a strategically significant area. We're in a debris corridor with marginal cover and 1 viable extraction route. What did your team do? Verith said, and then, before she could answer, he pulled up the timeline of Kethal operational activity in the Holveth corridor over the past 14 months. There were 3 significant anomalies. 3 points where anticipated Kethal movements had failed to materialize at the times and locations their own prior signaling had suggested. A flanking maneuver that never landed. A supply interdiction that arrived 6 hours late to a position already vacated. A comm relay destruction attempt that hit a decoy installation while the real relay remained intact. All 3 failures corresponded within a narrow window to the deployment dates of Forward Observation Team 7. He looked at her across the desk. She was watching him work through it, not impatiently, but with the focused attention of someone who already knows the answer and is waiting to see how long it takes the question to arrive. You were feeding them false position data, he said. We were confirming position data they already had, she said. Which is different. He set down the data pad. Explain the difference. She put one hand flat on the edge of the desk, a gesture he had come to recognize in humans as a grounding action rather than an aggressive one. The Kethal are good at intelligence work. One of the things that makes them good is that they weight information by source. A signal intercept is worth a certain amount. Analyst inference is worth more. Independent confirmation from a ground source is worth significantly more than either. If you tell an enemy their intelligence is wrong, they trust their intelligence. If you give them a ground-level source that confirms their intelligence, they stop asking questions. Verith processed that for a moment. You had an asset inside their intelligence network. We had access to their communications architecture through the debrief field coverage gaps. We could monitor their assessment process in near real time for a window of about 72 hours on either end of a deployment. We could not interject into their process directly. She paused. We could be observed. She said it simply, as if the conclusion were obvious, which, now that she had laid out the logic, it was. She had positioned her team where they would be detected in the specific moments when Kethal surveillance assets were covering that zone, and she had made sure that what the surveillance assets observed was not the actual position data of the Allied force, but a version of it, calculated to produce a specific set of Keth-Al operational decisions, not feeding false information into the enemy network. Something more patient than that, becoming the false confirmation that made the enemy confident in information that was already wrong. He was quiet for a long moment. The coolant hum filled the room. On the display behind her head, the 3 anomalous failures sat in their timeline column, patient as stones. "How many of your team were aware of this?" he said. "All of them," she said. "You can't run a thing like that with partial information. Everyone needs to know what behavior is safe to exhibit and what isn't. The difference between a normal patrol pattern and a pattern designed to be misread is invisible from the outside, but it's not invisible to the team doing it." "And if the Keth-Al had identified the deception," he said. Something moved across her face then, not quite an expression. The alien taxonomy his briefing materials applied to human faces was limited in this range, but a small shift in the muscles around the eyes and jaw that he would have described, if pressed, as weight. "Yes," she said, "that was the risk." He thought about what she had not said. He thought about it for several seconds, tracing the shape of the thing she was not putting into words, because she did not volunteer information she had not been asked for, and because she was not going to explain the cost of a thing in order to make herself look like she had paid it. She had answered the question she had been asked. The rest of it, the 12 deployments, the 68 kilometers from the nearest friendly position, the 3 casualties who had walked into that debris corridor, knowing what it would look like if the Keth-Al figured out what was happening. She left where it belonged, in the record, available to be read by anyone who chose to look. He chose to look. "Your team had 3 casualties over the course of those 12 deployments," he said. "2, she said. "The third wasn't related." He found the relevant entry in the log. She was correct. He had miscounted. "2 casualties, he said. "Okafor and Tsukino," she said. The names landed in the room without ceremony, the way she said most things, but the small movement around her jaw happened again. "Both within the first 6 months before we had refined the positioning methodology enough to reduce the detection window. After that, we went 8 deployments without a casualty." He wanted to ask her how she had learned the positioning methodology, how one refined a technique for being correctly observed while producing incorrect conclusions, and he suspected the answer was that one learned it by losing people to the version that did not work and then thinking very carefully about why it had not worked. He did not ask that because she had not offered it and because the shape of the answer was already visible in the silence around the names Okafor and Tsukino. "Corporal," he said, "I want to ask you something directly. And I want you to understand that I am not asking in an institutional capacity. I am asking because I am trying to understand something." She waited. "The Keth-Al did not identify you as a command threat," he said. "They did not identify you as a technical threat or a logistical threat. Those ratings apply to the 5 names above yours on this list." He touched the document. "They identified you specifically as an operational threat. Their assessment language uses a phrase that my translator renders as something like active environmental manipulation. I have been working with Keth-Al briefing language for 11 cycles. I have not seen that classification applied to an individual asset before. I have seen it applied to weapons systems." She looked at him for a moment. The coolant panels hummed. "They started noticing about 4 months in," she said. "The first 2 failures they probably attributed to their own planning process. The third one, they looked at harder. They went back and cross-referenced the timing with our deployment cycles. They figured out the mechanism before we finished refining it. A small pause. They're good analysts. They are, he agreed. So, they understood what we were doing, and they understood that we'd gotten better at it after the first 2 failures, and they understood that the improvement corresponded to the casualties. She stopped. I don't know exactly what language they used internally to describe that, but whatever it was, they found it concerning enough to prioritize. He did know what language they used internally. He had the document. The phrase, active environmental manipulation, was a polite translation. The more precise rendering of the Keth Al original carried a quality closer to patient predatory adaptation, a terminology his translation matrix had flagged as unusual because the Keth Al reserved that classification for apex-level biological threats in natural environments, not for personnel in a military context. The Keth Al had watched 2 of her teammates die as a result of an imprecise version of a technique, and they had watched her survive and iterate, and they had concluded, through the specific logic of their own threat assessment framework, that this was a thing they needed to stop before it became something larger. They had been right to conclude that. He understood, sitting across the desk from her in the recycled air quiet of the intelligence annex, that they had been entirely right. Corporal Reyes, he said, I have a second question. She nodded. The 3 failures identified, the flanking maneuver, the supply interdiction, the relay attack, they correspond to an estimated reduction in Keth Al operational effectiveness in this corridor of somewhere between 19 and 23%, depending on which baseline model my analysts use. That is not a small number. That is the kind of operational degradation that changes a campaign timeline by months. He paused. Are those 3 events the complete picture? She looked at him across the desk with the gray-green eyes that held the coolant panel light, and she said, No. He was quiet. Those are the 3 you could see from the signals data you have access to, she said. Failures are visible. The disruptions that didn't result in failed operations are harder to track because they look like routine planning variants from the outside. He pulled up the full operational log for the Halveth Corridor campaign across the same 14-month window. He had reviewed this data before, many times in the course of his ordinary work. He had been looking at it through the lens of command-level decisions and resource allocations and the broad strokes of Keth Al strategic intent. He had not been looking at it from 68 kilometers inside the debris corridor, through the specific lens of what could be made to look like routine planning variants. He started identifying the anomalies. It took him 4 minutes, which he considered embarrassing, because once he knew what to look for, they were not subtle. 6 additional events where Keth Al operational timing had shifted by windows between 8 and 40 hours. 3 where resource deployment had been reoriented in ways that seemed minor in isolation and less minor when traced to their downstream effects. 1 where an entire battalion-scale maneuver had been postponed by 11 days and then executed against a position that was, by that point, substantially less valuable than it had been 11 days earlier. He set the data pad down and looked across the desk at her. She had not moved while he worked. She sat with both hands flat on the table and the particular stillness he had been cataloging since she arrived, and she was watching him the way someone watches a process they are familiar with and are not anxious about the conclusion of. On his secondary display, the deployment cycle for Team 7 sat in its column, 12 entries across 14 months, 9 days average, 68 kilometers out. He looked at the 3rd entry, month 5, and then at the casualty field beside it, and then at the timing correspondence with the first of the 7 invisible events. The methodology had not been refined yet. The positioning window had been wrong by approximately 3 hours. 2 members of Team 7 had paid the cost of that 3-hour error, and she had noted it and corrected it. And on the next deployment, the window had been right. He had 17 cycles of professional experience, and he had been reading this data wrong for 14 months. 10 events. The 3 obvious failures, and 7 that had been invisible because they did not look like failures. They looked like ordinary military planning, the kind of small delays and redirections that happen in every complex operation for 100 mundane reasons. The kind that no analyst would flag unless they were specifically looking for the shape of a 68-kilometer long intelligence manipulation running on a 12-deployment cycle. 10, he said. 10 that had measurable effects, she said. There were others that didn't pan out. You can't control for everything. He sat back in his chair. His secondary appendages, which had been folded since she walked in, unfolded slightly in a posture his colleagues would have recognized as recalibration. He was a senior analyst of 17 cycles. He had spent 11 of those cycles studying the Keth Owl specifically. He was, by any institutional measure, good at his work. He had just been shown, by a human corporal assigned to a forward observation team in a debris corridor, that he had been looking at the Halveth campaign data for 14 months without seeing something that had been visible in it the entire time. He did not find this pleasant. He also could not find anything in it to argue with. The campaign modeling office, he said, has been projecting another 4 to 7 standard months of active operations in this corridor before a stable defensive line can be established. I know, she said. I've read the projections. If your operational analysis is correct, he said slowly, and I am increasingly inclined to believe it is, the degradation your team has introduced into Keth Owl planning capacity may have materially shortened that timeline. She neither confirmed nor denied this. She looked at him in the way she had been looking at him throughout, steadily, without apparent investment in what he was going to do with the information. You wrote no reports about this, he said. I filed standard forward observation logs, she said. What we observed. Movement patterns, atmospheric conditions, debris field changes. What my team needed to do in order to observe it was internal to our operational methodology. That goes in verbal debrief, not written record. He thought about that. The verbal debrief process in the human contingent was conducted with the team's direct commanding officer, who, for forward observation team 7, was a lieutenant whose name appeared in Verath's files as a largely administrative presence. He had not read those debrief records because they were not his jurisdiction. He had not known to read them. He suspected now that even the lieutenant had not fully understood what he was reading, because the language Corporal Reyes used to describe what she did was the language of standard observation methodology, and the difference between what it described at face value and what it actually described was a difference that required a Keith Al threat assessment document, an 11-cycle analyst, and about 45 minutes of direct conversation to locate. I want to bring this to Colonel Dravasi, he said. All right, she said. I would like you to be present for that conversation. She tilted her head very slightly, a movement he had catalogued in other humans as a non-verbal precursor to a question. The question did not come. She simply said, When? Tomorrow, 800, he said, if that suits. It suits, she said, and stood up from the chair in one motion that was, again, not quite casual, the kinetic system quality again, the kind of readiness that her body apparently defaulted to, regardless of context. She picked up the copy of the Keth Owl document from the edge of the desk. read the sixth entry one more time with the same expression she had worn reading it the first time, and set it back down. She was at the door before he thought to say it. "Corporal," she stopped. "The threat rating," he said. "Did you know, before today, that they had classified you at that level?" She stood for a moment with her back to him, facing the door. When she turned, the expression on her face was the one he had catalogued as weight. Not sorrow exactly, not pride, something more specific than either of those things, and harder to name. "I knew they were paying attention," she said. "I figured they had formed an opinion." He waited to see if she would say more. She did not. She left, and the door closed behind her, and Verath sat for a long time in the recycled air quiet with the Keith Al document on his desk and the operational timeline on his display, and he looked at the 10 events again, slowly, one at a time. The first Solvathi to encounter one of the great filter predators of their homeworld, he knew from species history, had made the same mistake his civilization had made for generations afterward. They had looked at the predator's size, measured it against their own, noted the discrepancy, and concluded they understood the relationship between the two species. They had been wrong, not because the predator was larger than it appeared, but because size had never been the relevant variable. The relevant variable was patience. The relevant variable was the capacity to read an environment at a granularity fine enough to predict how behavior today would shape outcomes weeks from now. The relevant variable was the willingness to absorb cost and iterate, to lose ground in one dimension and gain it in 3 others. To do this, not because it was clever, but because on some deep biological level, it was simply how the organism functioned. He had been thinking about Corporal Reyes as a support asset assigned to a forward observation team. The Keith Al had been thinking about her as something else entirely. He was sitting here alone with the document and the timeline, and the 17 cycles of experience he had built his confidence on, revising his position toward theirs. The meeting with Colonel Dravasi happened at 800 as scheduled, in a conference room 3 levels above the intelligence annex that smelled of metal and human coffee, and the particular dry warmth of a space where multiple species had been seated for extended periods. Verath attended with his senior analyst Prexon and 2 members of the campaign modeling team. The colonel arrived with 2 aides and a data pad already open to the campaign projections. Corporal Reyes arrived alone, 2 minutes before the hour, wearing the same worn observation gear she had worn the day before, and sat at the far end of the table. Verath presented the document and the timeline. He walked through the 10 events. He had prepared supporting analysis overnight, a cross-correlation of Keith Al operational changes against observation team deployment cycles, rendered in the standard council briefing format with the precision percentages and confidence intervals that institutional bodies expected before they revised assumptions. His 2 modeling team members had run the numbers independently and arrived at the same conclusion he had. The degradation in Keith Al operational capacity attributable to the methodology ran between 31 and 38% over the 14-month window, depending on how conservatively you weighted the 7 less visible events. The colonel listened without interruption. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with gray beginning in her hair at the temples, and the kind of attentiveness in her eyes that Verath recognized as genuine, not performed. When he finished, she looked down the table at Reyes. "Corporal," she said, "why didn't you report this?" Reyes considered the question for a moment, in that brief internal consultation way. "I reported what my team observed," she said. "The methodology for how we made the observations is in the verbal debrief record with Lieutenant Faber. It's his call whether that goes up the chain." The colonel looked at her steadily. "Lieutenant Faber," she said, "has been processing your debrief records as standard forward observation logs." "I know," Reyes said. A beat of quiet, "Are you telling me," the colonel said, "that you have been running a sustained active intelligence operation inside a HFY surveillance architecture in an unsupported position 68 kilometers from the nearest friendly asset for 14 months, and you have not formally reported it because your direct supervisor did not ask the right questions?" Reyes met her eyes. "I reported what I was asked to report," she said. "The methodology is operational, not reportable on the standard form." Something happened in the colonel's expression, a very small compression at the corners of her mouth that Vereth could not categorize, but that made 3 of the 5 humans in the room shift their weight almost simultaneously, as if they had each received the same signal. "That is a very careful answer," the colonel said. "I try to be accurate," Reyes said. The colonel looked at the timeline display for a long moment. Then she said, "The modeling office is projecting 4 to 7 months to a stable defensive line." "I've read the projection," Reyes said. "With what you've laid out here," the colonel said, "what's your estimate?" Reyes was quiet for a moment that ran long enough for Prexen, beside Vereth, to shift his weight in his chair. Then she said, "If the Keth Al have restructured their intelligence assessment process to account for the methodology, 6 weeks. If they haven't yet, 3. No one in the room said anything. The modeling team member to Vereth's left made a notation on his datapad with the focused attention of someone who is writing something down because it has moved past the point where memory is sufficient. 3 standard months, the colonel said carefully. 3 weeks, Reyes said. Not months. The colonel looked at the timeline again. She looked at Reyes. She looked at Vereth, who gave her the small Solvathi gesture that, in a meeting context, indicated he had already run the math and was not in a position to argue with the number. "You will report to the campaign modeling office," the colonel said. "Full brief. Take as much time as they need. Prexan," she looked at Vereth's analyst. "I want integration support from the intelligence annex throughout." Prexan made the affirmative gesture without hesitation. "I also want," the colonel said, and her tone shifted in a register that Vereth noted carefully, "a conversation with Lieutenant Faber about what goes in the standard form and what gets surfaced." Reyes said nothing to that. Her face held the specific quality of someone who has already had a version of that conversation internally and filed whatever they concluded from it somewhere past the point of revisiting. The meeting ended. 20 minutes later, the modeling team left first, the two of them already talking to each other in rapid, half-finished sentences. The colonel's aides followed. The colonel herself paused at the door and said, to the room in general and to no one in particular, "The Keith Al gave you their highest threat rating." Reyes, who was closing the briefing folder on the table in front of her, said, "So Analyst Sauce told me." "They were right to," the colonel said. It was not phrased as a compliment. It was phrased the way one notes a fact that carries implications one has not yet finished tracing. The colonel left, and her footsteps in the corridor faded toward the lift, and the room was quiet. Reyes picked up the folder and walked to the door. Vereth was still seated, making final notations in his own record, and he watched her go in the way he had been watching her throughout, with the specific attention of someone cataloging something important. At the door she paused, not the way people pause when they have forgotten something, the way they pause when they are deciding whether to say a thing they have already decided to say. "Analyst Sauce," she said. "Yes," he said. The Keth Al will revise that rating upward after today, she said. The meeting will show up in their surveillance reconstruction within 48 hours. They'll cross-reference the attendance list against the briefing content and figure out what we discussed. She paused. You should know that going in. He looked at her for a moment. Are you concerned? He said. She tilted her head very slightly in that precursor to a question way that had not produced a question the last time. This time it produced a small, dry sound that his translator classified as humor. Concerned is the wrong word, she said. It changes the parameters. Different parameters require a different methodology. She left. Her footsteps in the corridor were quieter than the colonel's had been, quieter than most people's were. The kind of quiet that his threat detection instincts would have filed under other circumstances as something to pay attention to. He sat in the conference room for several minutes after she was gone, with the timeline on the display and the Keth Al threat assessment on the table in front of him, and the notation in his own record about the rating revision that was coming, and what it would mean for the next phase of operations. 3 weeks to a stable defensive line, if the Keth Al had not yet restructured. He pulled up the Keth Al signals data from the past 48 hours. He looked at it with the specific lens she had shown him, the one that looked not for failures but for the shape of routine planning variance in a timeline that had no reason to vary routinely. He found 2 anomalies before the hour was out. He thought, while he noted them, about a question he had not asked her in either of their conversations. He had not asked because the answer was implicit in everything she had already said, and because asking it directly would have been a way of requesting something she had not volunteered, which she did not appear to do by instinct. The question was this. She had known since approximately the 4th month that the Keth Al were tracking her team specifically. She had known that the surveillance asset coverage was dedicated rather than incidental. She had continued the methodology for 10 more months and 10 more deployments, refining it, improving the window, reducing but not eliminating the risk of detection in a debris corridor 68 kilometers from the nearest position where anyone could have reached her team in time if something had gone wrong. She had done this not because she was ordered to. She had done it because the methodology was working, and because no one had told her to stop, and because she had looked at the 10-event record, and whatever calculation she had made at the end of it had come out on the side of continuing. He did not know exactly what that calculation looked like from the inside. He suspected it did not look like much. He suspected it looked like a morning deployment briefing and a debris corridor and a positioning window that was now refined to 47 minutes, and a team that had been briefed on the risks and had continued showing up, and a Keth Al surveillance architecture that was paying very close attention for exactly the reasons she wanted it to pay attention. He did not know whether to find that thought reassuring. He noted the 2 anomalies, forwarded them to the modeling team, and held the uncomfortable awareness that the answer to his unasked question was probably not something that fell cleanly into either category. He did not know whether to feel better or less comfortable about that. He filed the notation, forwarded the data to the modeling team, and sat for one more moment with the quiet hum of the station around him, thinking about what it meant to have found exactly what he was looking for, and to still not be entirely certain whether that made him safer or more precisely calibrated to the size of a thing he had been underestimating for 14 months. The report he submitted to the Galactic Council Intelligence Directorate 12 days later listed Corporal Maya Reyes in the summary section under the heading of Operational Assets. The category field, which had room for 20 characters, said what it said. He had spent a long time choosing the language. On the morning of the 19th day, a message arrived in his operations queue from a routing address he did not immediately recognize. It was 4 lines long. It said that the second Keth-L flanking element had repositioned overnight, that the repositioning matched the variance pattern he had identified in the signal's data, and that Team 7 was already in position to observe it, and that, if the Halveth corridor held through the next 11 days, the timeline projection would be accurate within 72 hours. He read it twice. The routing address resolved, on the second look, to a standard field communications tag, the kind assigned to forward observation teams on active deployment. 68 kilometers out, in the debris field, already watching. He leaned back in his chair, in the recycled air quiet of the intelligence annex, and he did not know whether to flag the message as intelligence or as confirmation or as something else, some category he did not yet have a clean word for, and after a moment he decided the distinction was academic, filed it in all 3 places, and got back to work. The coolant panels hummed, the displays glowed blue. Somewhere in the debris field near Relay Point Sigma, a small team was doing something that looked, from any surveillance angle the Keth-Al owned, like routine observation. The Keth-Al, by now, knew it was not routine. They had given her their highest individual threat rating, which was a thing Verath had spent 14 days thinking about. And the more he thought about it, the more it seemed to him that the most accurate thing he could say about that rating was that it had not been high enough. He sat with that thought for a moment, and then he put it where he put all the thoughts he had not finished yet, in the part of his mind that kept working, long after he had turned to other things, and he turned to other things, and he did not quite stop thinking about it.